This meeting is being recorded.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. So I read a really interesting column in the National Post about a week ago by Michelle Coates-Mather, who is the founder and principal consultant of Presence and Influence. I love that, Presence and Influence. She is the former director of communications for the Jean Charest leadership campaign, and it's about her experience during the campaign and what she thought about Jean Charest and Pierre Poliov and the chances for winning and what it is, what the prospects for moderates in the Conservative Party going forward. The title of her piece was Jean Charest ran a hard-fought race. There's nothing gloomy about that, because someone else had called his defeat a gloomy end to his career. So, Michelle Coates-Mather, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you. Thanks so much. I'm doing great. You know, we've gotten over the political adrenaline hangover, so caught up on sleep, and yeah, no, I'm feeling good. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for your column, because it's interesting. You know, I've been a political activist my whole life, and losing is not fun. And keeping your head high when you've lost is really critically important. What did you think about Pratt, who was a volunteer in the campaign, and he suggested it was a gloomy end to Jean Charest's political life?
Well, I mean, I think this won't come as a surprise. I have a very different view than Mr. Pratt, who yes, was an advisor and a strong advisor to Mr. Charest on the especially on our Quebec team. I, though, as the director of communications, had the privilege of supporting Mr. Charest, day in and day out for the 6-month leadership race. So, as it often goes, those of us that have those sort of full-time roles on the campaigns have, I would say, slightly different perspective, because we're in the know. We're seeing the polling, the data, we understand the strategy and all the pieces of the puzzles that are coming together. So I felt it was important because, as is the case with all leadership races, there's always a postmortem by pundits and, the political analyzers who give their 2 cents on what they saw. And I think that's all fair, because these things are very subjective, right? But what we hadn't heard was the voice of somebody who was actually on the campaign. So I felt it was important that I gave my 2 cents, which was largely that, look, we knew, and Jean knew, even before we entered the race, that it was going to be an uphill battle. I mean, he was certainly the underdog in the race. He had been out of politics for almost a decade. And so we knew we would have to reintroduce him, not just to Conservative Party members, but Canadians, because the goal, at least in the first 3 months of the leadership race, was to attract new members to the party so they could buy memberships. So for those of your listeners, so that they understand, to vote in the leadership race, you have to be a member of the party. So that meant that we had to do what we could to position a compelling position for him and find a way to differentiate him from Mr. Poliov, who was well known, had a very strong momentum within, I would say, the base of the party, and had certainly been working very hard to develop his momentum since Mr. Poliov decided not to run in the leadership race 2 years ago. So he certainly had an edge on Mr. Charest and our campaign. But even with that knowledge, Mr. Charest felt very compelled to get engaged, and he had a lot of folks encouraging him to do so, because the view, I think, with leadership races is that coronations are never good for a party. Really, this is part of the democratic process. And I think, if anything, the results at the end of this race, Mr. Poliov won, a substantive majority of the membership vote. And he did so in the context of a competitive race. So there can be no debate around, his win. It was a solid win. And, I think what Jean did, or what he offered, and to me, this is the biggest takeaway or the biggest benefit of having him engaged, was he drove the policy discussion on key issues that are really important today in the Canadian, political context. Things like defense and security, northern security in particular, healthcare reform, talking about Bill 21 and religious freedom and rights in this country and things of that nature. And Jean, forced, I think, conversations on those really important policy topics. So the last thing I would say, just in terms of what it all meant, or the benefit of having him engaged, is that he did give moderates a voice in the leadership race. I think there's there's a swath of conservative voters or conservative party members who for a while were trying to figure out where they fit into the party umbrella, and having someone like Jean, who I would suggest, he comes from the progressive conservative side of the historical context of the party, brought with him this understanding of, strong economic discipline, but an understanding that government does play an important role in our society. And how can we, maximize government services in a more efficient way than what we might be getting from the Liberal Party. And also that we weren't getting tied up in the nonsense of social issues that moderates just, don't have much space for in terms of that debate around, reproductive rights or same-sex marriage or these types of things. But he became, I think, that champion for a lot of us. And now it's up to Mr. Poliov to show moderates that they still have a place under his leadership.
We're chatting tonight with Michelle Coates-Mather, who is the Director of Communications for Jean Charest in the just concluded Conservative Party leadership. We're going to take a break for some messages, and I'm going to come back in just 2 minutes with Michelle. And I'm going to try to address some of these issues, because she suggests it was a very policy-oriented leadership campaign, or at least that Jean Charest was able to raise policies. I'm not sure if that's the case. I really think it was a very personal one. I think it was driven by a whole bunch of calls for freedom, and whether there was a place for moderates in the party. I really worry that the party has changed dramatically, and it's been a takeover of the party by extremists on the right that were associated with either the truck convoy or Maxime Bernier's PCP party or things like that. So we got some really good issues that we're going to chat about in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Back in 2.
This meeting is being recorded.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Michelle Coates-Mather, who is the Director of Communications for Jean Charest in the just concluded Conservative Leadership Campaign. And she's written an article that I found quite interesting in the National Post, I guess just a week ago, that talked about Charest ran a hard-fought race, but there's nothing gloomy about that, because someone else had suggested it was a gloomy end to his career. And we're talking about leadership races, and I gotta, Michelle, you were saying that Jean Charest had an opportunity to bring up a bunch of policies. I've been involved in leadership campaigns, both in the Conservative Party as well as the Liberal Party, and both provincially and federally. I don't think I've ever been party. I don't think I've ever seen or watched closely a leadership campaign that was less policy oriented and more personal attack oriented. And the closest that I ever saw was maybe Ignatieff and Ray, that became very personal in their attacks, and that was still not that bad. There seems to be, a hatred and the insults that were going back and forth. One saying, because you were a Liberal premier, you're not worthy of being leader of the Conservative Party, and then the retort being, because you don't believe in law and you supported the truckers, you're not eligible to become a person that passes laws and a prime minister of Canada. Like, wasn't there more animosity in this campaign than I'm almost ever seen before?
I mean, I think that is a very fair observation. It was very intense from the get-go. Even before Mr. Charest had entered the race, he was subject to those attacks, particularly, around that idea, as you said, about him being labeled a liberal. And it did feel personal. So candidly, yes, it did, especially over 6 months. And I think that the challenge now for the new party leader is to figure out how to put sort of that the personal attacks, the animosity aside, to show moderates or Charest supporters that there's a place for them in the party. And
we'll come back to the whole moderate thing and progressive conservatism and stuff in a minute. But let's stay on that communication. You were the director of communications. How did you advise? How did you deal with that animosity, with that vitriol? What was your recommendation? What was your advice? Tit for tat?
Tit for tat. I mean, look, I think for those who have witnessed Jean's career, I mean, he is certainly a fighter, and I don't think anybody would expect him to take sort of personal attacks lying down. So from our perspective, the guardrails that we tried to stay within, which is fair, I think, during a leadership race, is, contrasting on policy and record is completely fair game. I think Jean certainly did his part to stay away from personal attacks. You had mentioned at the onset of your question, Jean's perception about Mr. Poliev's engagement with the convoy. Well, from our perspective, especially at that time, that was a fair guardrail for contrast, because those are things that Mr. Poliev had done, right? So, and the party, and this is something that I don't think people realize, is the data, at least within the original 190K membership, was the party was split on that issue. So while Mr. Poliev had already galvanized those that sort of supported the convoy, there was, roughly half of the party that didn't identify with that. So that was an opportunity for Mr. Charest to differentiate himself within the membership. But certainly, I think as things went on, you are right, it became clear that the frontrunner, Mr. Poliev, and his campaign team felt that contrasting those attacks and really doubling down on Jean being a liberal were beneficial in the context of a leadership race. Would it be as beneficial in general election? No.
So I was president of a riding association in West Vancouver of the BC Liberal Party, the provincial party. And it was a conservative party, even though it was called a liberal party. And so I, more than almost anybody, realized that liberal parties in Quebec and in British Columbia are liberal in name only and not in policy and ideology. But that is confusing to people.
Oh yeah.
And Jean never got over that attack, did he? A lot of conservatives that, aren't knowledgeable about the political process, particularly if they don't know anything about BC politics or Quebec politics, only their own provincial politics or federal politics, think he was a liberal premier. No?
Yeah, I mean, the fact that you have the word liberal, in his background, yes, you're right about that. Those of us who work in the political bubble understand what that means, and the context there, and the fact that at the time there was no conservative party in Quebec. The whole reason he went was to fight the separatist movement in Quebec. That's how he came to be premier. But you're right, we were never able to get past that accusation of him being a liberal. And I think what we need to keep in mind too in party politics is that this quickly became, in my view, this race like an ideological purity test, right? And Jean and our campaign team and others who supported Jean weren't viewed as being conservative enough. And I think that is a shame, because one of the risks I think the Conservative Party will face if it doesn't get past the purity test is that you alienate swaths of voters that do in fact identify with conservative economic policies or defense policies or what have you. So that is something I think the new leadership is going to have to grapple with. Because we can't just sort of decide, oh, you may have liberal tendencies that you're not a conservative, or we can't get your vote. Not at all. But that's something that they're going to have to.
It's not just that, is it? It's that, and you come back to this moderate, and I really want to talk about that in great detail. But I interviewed former mayor of Toronto. He's a distant relative of mine, not a close relative of mine, former Tory cabinet minister, David Crombie, who I think a lot of conservatives thought highly of. And a lot of Tonians will tell me every time I meet them, oh, are you related to the Tiny Perfect Mayor? He was the best mayor we ever had. People had a lot of respect for him. I interviewed him and he said he didn't leave the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party left him. There's a lot of progressive conservatives, moderate conservatives, that feel that the Conservative Party of today is no longer the progressive Conservative Party of the old. It's not. And it's too right-wing for them. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is what are we defining as right wing? This isn't a genuine question, because there's certainly this underlying theme right now, or conversation happening about populism and how populism has really impacted the conservative movement today. So those on the progressive side who don't identify with the populism sentiment tend to be those that have more traditional associations, right, with the conservative movement. They believe in, institutions, law and order, things of that nature.
But the Conservative Party was always the law and order party.
They were.
Now it's the party of freedom.
Freedom, exactly. Which is really, I mean, that is, I think, Mr. Poliev's attempt to capitalize on populist sentiment. But what I think progressives, and this is even something, I myself have had to realize, is we don't do ourselves a favor when we dismiss that populist movement as nothing more than freedom or angry people or anti-vaxxers or anti-whatever. I think it's much more than that. Like, in my view, sort of populism stems from a failure of leadership elsewhere, right? That movement starts when people don't feel they're being heard or listened to. And I think that's the challenge that the current prime minister now has to face, is if he continues to alienate those folks or put them in one category, he runs the risk of galvanizing that movement even more so against him. So, it's a really, honestly, I find, as a political enthusiast, I actually find this to be a really fascinating time in Canadian politics. But I worry that if we're not careful, we will go down sort of that angry path that we've been seeing happening in the U.S. And I'm hopeful that we don't go that way.
Isn't your current leader actually benefiting from that angry extreme and encouraging it and enabling it and growing it?
Certainly, I think during the leadership race, that was a movement that he was certainly able to capitalize on. I mean, he sold 312,000 memberships. The Conservative Party of Canada is now the biggest party in Canadian political history.
To who?
And I think
who did he sell them to?
Well, exactly. I mean, that's a good question. Likely those folks who were feeling like this current government isn't meeting their needs and their responsibilities.
So did Pierre Poliov win the Conservative Party leadership race, or was this a takeover of the Conservative Party by anti-vaxxers and the truck convoy supporters?
Well, again, are we sure that we're in a position to say that all of those folks are anti-vaxxers and convoy supporters?
So I don't know. But I had lunch with someone who was very involved in the truck convoy process just 2 days ago, and she told me that somehow that Poliov got holds of all the emails, and she said that there were tons and tons of people that were in Ottawa, people involved in the occupation, people that the convoy, Freudian slip on the occupation, apologize that. And then I met with someone, a big supporter of Andrew Scheer, worked in Andrew Scheer's office, who was very involved in the Poliov campaign. And she said, Brian, these rallies are incredible. Whole new young people that I've never seen involved in politics before. Not masks, not, very, very supportive of the truck convoy, etc., that have gotten involved in the party. And she saw that as a positive, a very huge positive, that all these new young anti-vax, anti-COVID, COVID denying people were involved in the party. 15% of the Canadian population, according to polls, supported the truck convoy. So there is, 3 million people, 3.5 million people that were supportive, supposedly based on polls of the policies of and the issues that the truck convoy was supporting. But that means that there's 85% of Canadians that don't. And so I come back to maybe given the timing of the leadership, given how open it was to have people get involved, really what's happened is that the truck convoy took over the Conservative Party.
I mean, certainly that's what a lot of folks believe to have happened during this race. And I mean, there's no question it's not the same party makeup as it once was. The base of the party has changed after this leadership race. But you're right. And I think this to me is the most interesting point. 85% of Canadians feel differently than that 15%. But again, so the challenge now is how do we accept that there are real frustrations and irritants within that 15% that do need to be addressed without exploiting the anger and the misinformation that has been going back and forth from certain segments of that group. I caution people against labeling every single person that bought memberships for Pierre as convoyists, anti-vax or whatever the label is. We need to be very careful of that because it delegitimizes, I think, some real frustration. But I would also caution Mr. Poliov and if I were advising him that, again, we've got winning the leadership is one thing, but we've got to win a general election now. And I think that the majority of Canadians we know are not in that headspace. We got our vaccines, we followed the rules, we did all the things we needed to do because we were making decisions based on the information we had at that time. But it's time to move on now from that. So it's a choice, I think a strategic choice that Mr. Poliov and his team will have to make moving forward is how do you tell that story? How do you square that circle with the general electorate?
So I've interviewed a bunch of different people that have told me the biggest problem that Aaron O'Toole had was that people didn't trust him because of the pivot that he did, which some people don't call a pivot, they call a dramatic turn to the center, that he ran from the right. He got support from the ideological right in the leadership campaign. And then he came out as a centrist during his leadership, and particularly during and just before the leadership campaign. And so therefore this flip-flopping, this change made him untrustworthy. And so you couldn't believe it. You didn't know where he actually stood. So can Pierre Poliov actually change? Can he become a centrist? If that's your advice, where the Canadian population is, can he do it?
No, actually, I don't think. Well, a couple of things. I don't believe that he will pivot and become a centrist all of a sudden. He's not. He's a traditional conservative in a lot of ways, right? So, what I do think, though, what I suspect we're going to see, because it's already happening, if anybody who pays attention to social media or what have you, there's a very subtle, nuanced shift in messaging. During the campaign, as you've mentioned, he was full tilt, freedom, 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 take back control of your life. Now we're seeing a very subtle shift towards the benefits of that freedom. So meaning, some example of that would be, within days of him winning the leadership race, it doesn't matter who you love or what your last name is, you have the right to live a prosperous life in this country. I'm paraphrasing one of his tweets, which I thought was very interesting because certainly there's this, I think that the Liberals have this tendency to immediately go back to, conservatives are, they don't like reproductive rights. They want to get into issues of same-sex marriage, all of these things. And to me, that suggests that Pierre is trying to shift away from all of that. You can't get me on those things anymore because I'm focusing on the benefits of what that freedom actually delivers. So but he's not going to change his policy positioning or his ideology. What I'll be curious to see is if he shifts his approach.
We're chatting tonight with Michelle, who is the Director of Communications for the Jean Charest campaign. What an incredible experience she must have had in the last 6 months. Michelle Coates-Mather, the Director of Communications, she's written an article in the National Post about the experience as being Director of Communication, and saying that this was actually an honorable thing that Jean Charest did, not a gloomy thing, which some others have said. We're going to take a break, and And for some messages, they'll be just back in 2 minutes. I'm going to talk a little bit more about whether there's room for moderates in the Conservative Party today. Going to talk about some of the conspiracy theories that her opponent was talking about during the leadership campaign, and yet the attacks against those conspiracy theories just didn't seem to either happen or stick. And I'm going to ask her what the future is for the Conservative Party. Stay with us, everybody. Back in 2.
This meeting is being recorded.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Michelle Coates-Mather, who was the Director of Communications for the Jean Charest campaign. You currently run a communications consulting company that's got a really interesting title. What's the title of your communications company?
Presence and influence.
Presence and influence. I love that. What's presence and influence all about? You're telling people how they can have better stage presence or be a social.
That's part of it. Certainly, that's part of it. I think a big part of our value offering is just this idea of helping sort of clients figure out what their value pitch is. That each client, no matter whether you're dealing with government, whether it's internal communications, that pitching your value proposition to your stakeholders is a really critical part to meeting whatever your corporate and financial objectives might be, for example. And that all of us can have the presence to have the influence that we need to meet those objectives.
So I got to ask you, you said that Jean Charest was focused on policies and trying to create presence and influence effectively during the leadership campaign. And I've had the pleasure of listening to him a couple times over the last couple of years. And I'm a little older than you. I was there in Montreal when he was Captain Canada. And when I think of one of the most important events, both positive and negative in Canadian history, it was that we came so close to losing Canada in the Quebec referendum. And I don't think if it was not for Jean Charest and Captain Canada in that rally in Montreal, I'm not sure whether we would have won by 50.1%. I think I fear for what. And so he played such a critically important role. It was almost though as if they didn't count for anything in the leadership campaign. And I've heard him speak at different events in Montreal, where I've done business, as well as in Toronto. And he was, I hate to use this analogy, but let me use it. He was like Bill Clinton. He could sit down for 45 minutes or an hour and speak off the top on issue after issue after issue. And you said, this man's got more content, more knowledge, more current knowledge of what the issues are, the players are, and what needs to happen than anyone else I've ever met. Like, the guy's knowledge and his breadth of knowledge was impressive. And then he was competing against a guy who's known as an attack dog, who never held a really important executive post, has not done anything in life other than politics since he was in his early 20s. Put a video on of him smoking hookah, talking about Bitcoin. Wanted to fire the governor of the Bank of Canada, wanted to outlaw anyone going to World Economic Forum events, which is a conspiracy theory that, the QAnon supporters currently believe. Why couldn't you, as the Director of Communications, and Jean Charest, one of the smartest men I've ever met, get over that and get into policy and criticize effectively and shut up this guy who seemed to be a conspiracy theorist?
So it's interesting. Again, we were at the onset of this interview. We talked a little bit about having data, right? The internal data. And what I think we have to remember is that polling, so that 85% that we referenced around the general public, they were not representative of the folks that we were trying to engage, right? So the Conservative Party membership, or that available bracket that we had who had bought memberships and we were looking to persuade, held very different views. And I think the reality is, we and Jean spent the first 3 months releasing detailed policy, and we sold memberships off of that. So every policy we put out, we sold a membership. And so certainly in the beginning, I think he did drive all of that policy discourse, but then persuasion happens. And that's where it got tricky, because it was very apparent to us that the folks that had bought memberships for Mr. Poliov were not interested in the things that we had to talk about.
So unless we were, I'm right, it was a takeover of the Conservative Party by those truck convoy supporters.
Essentially, there was a segment, the membership segment, who I think we're more motivated and mobilized by, I'm calling it rage farming, right? So unless we were talking about
rage farming?
Rage farming is what I would call it. So that's really big on social media. So you'll see it happen right now, right? So when we talk about vaccine mandates, restrictions, all of those things, it elicits this emotional reaction from people. And because we were talking about restrictions, but in the context of healthcare reform, and even though that is an important discussion to be had, it wasn't, I don't think, getting to the crux of the emotive anger that people were feeling, which was no more lockdowns, this shouldn't have happened, bad choices were made, right? And that, I think, is the challenge that we came up against, because we had agreed that we weren't going to play that game. And that is the reality of our political discourse. If you're not willing to play the political polarization game, it's hard to win.
This meeting is being recorded.
So, Michelle, this concerns me. It really concerns me. I mentioned that I had lunch with someone who was very involved in the truck convoy, and was part of the Conservative Party, and I think probably, she didn't say, but probably voted for your opponent. And she said that the vast majority of the truck convoy supporters believe Russia's position on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That she said, COVID wasn't real. Pierre Trudeau, Justin Trudeau, Freudian slip again, owned the patents for some of the vaccines. Like, there are some conspiracy theories that are within that group that are, to me, a little scary. And if that's what is the predominant thought of a lot of those new people that have entered the Conservative Party, taking memberships on it and been the support base that Pierre Poliov won with, that's concerning to me, isn't it?
Yep, it is. It's very concerning and disheartening. And I think that is, frankly, going to be the challenge that Mr. Poliov is going to have to address going forward. He's gonna have to figure out how to disassociate himself from that, because the bottom line is those views, especially the ones you were just talking about, the views that are held by some in regards to Russia, I mean, it's just unbelievable. Especially everything we know now and everything that's happened in the last 6 months. And he's, in my view, that is a vulnerability. So I think what will matter now, and what people need to watch for, is how he spends his time, what policies he plans to focus on in the House, and what he's going to be advocating for. So I have a feeling we're not going to hear much about those particular issues. I suspect we're going to hear a lot less about the WEF and the conspiracy issues that I think galvanized quite a bit of support during the membership sale period. We'll hear a lot less about that, for the reasons that you said at the onset. These are not issues that the general public are aligned with.
The just inflation, word that supposedly a whole bunch of Conservative MPs are trying to get into question period and enhanced and talk about in the House of Commons, seems to have a little bit of traction. But is it honest when you've got inflation around the world, and in most places actually worse than it is in Canada, and Bank of England, Bank of Europe, the Federal Reserve in the United States increasing interest rates, bank rates, just as much, if not frankly more, than we're doing in Canada? Is that criticism going to stick? Is it honest? If you were the head of communications for Poliov, would you be advising him to do it?
So candidly, it is effective. It is effective because there's no question, regardless of what's happening globally, people are thinking about what's happening to them at home, right? How much groceries are costing, the rising cost of gas, all of these things. People are thinking about these impacts to their livelihood, their households, their families. So because of that, the just inflation tagline is highly effective, and it's quick, it's easy, and it allows people to direct blame accordingly. I think too, Justin Trudeau hasn't done himself, any he hasn't given himself any kudos, if you will, when he says things like, I don't think about economic policy. I mean, he's put a target on his back when it comes to the economy. There's no question. So, and we have yet to see, other than continuing to add, to spend more, tax and spending, there's no real plan or strategy to help with economic growth. So I think for Mr. Poliov, that is actually the space, if I were advising him, he should be spending all of his time on. Affordability in the economy. This is the #1 issue right now that binds all Canadians. It's something that all Canadians are concerned about because everyone has been impacted.
What's James Carville's famous line?
What is it?
It's all about the economy, stupid, or something like that, isn't it?
But it's true though, right? Because it there's an emotional attachment to the economy too, because it keeps a lot of us up at night. And I think that, depending on when an election is called, that is only going to become a more precarious position for Mr. Trudeau, because I think we all think it's going to get worse before it gets better.
Yeah, but you think about the just inflation, and if that's the correct criticism, you got to take action against it, and that's effectively what the Conservative government in the UK did this past week. Tried to take action against it and destroyed the pound. The pound is at the worst level it's ever been. Destroyed the economy. The Bank of England had to intervene this week and say that we're potentially in financial distress effectively in the United Kingdom, and so therefore blaming inflation on a domestic cause when it really is an international issue, and then trying to take action to cushion the local population's impact of it in the UK has led to a economic disaster.
And that will be the area of opportunity for Justin Trudeau and the Liberals. They're going to have to make that contrast themselves, right? It's up to them to be able to show Canadians that they have the better offering than Mr. Poliov. But the question is, are they doing that right now? My sense is no. There's a reason Justin Trudeau's polling has gone down. Now, we are certainly heading into a change election, but I think it's so much more than that. Trudeau, there's a trust and credibility issue right now around Trudeau that I think Canadians are really grappling with. So, it's Mr. Poliev's role to hold Justin Trudeau to account, and it's Justin Trudeau's role to prove to Canadians that he has the right mix of solutions to help fight inflation, to help make life more affordable, to deal with supply chain issues. And I think there's this consensus that we're not getting that kind of leadership from him at this point.
So there was a couple 100,000 people that made the decision in the Conservative leadership. And that's frankly the size of maybe 1 or 2 ridings in Canada. In reality, it's not a heck of a lot of people. And you're right that it may be the largest party in Canadian political history, but it's still a fairly small sliver. And if I'm right, that it was very influenced by a lot of people that were new members of the party that joined from the extreme right, from the trucker convoy and that issue. As Canadians become more familiar with the Conservative Party of today, the supporters of Pierre Poliov, are they going to feel comfortable with the Conservative Party of today? And we mentioned this sort of, is there room for moderates in the Conservative Party of today earlier in our interview. I've interviewed some people with something called center-ice conservatives now. I think they're now called center-ice Canadians, that are arguing that the vast majority of Canadians are in the center of the political spectrum. They're fiscal conservatives, they're social progressives. The vast majority believed in COVID-19, believed in social distancing, believed in vaccinations. And in fact, when they say freedom, we'll also say responsibility. Think that freedom and responsibility comes together, not just freedom, even if it means I can, occupy your city or take over your streets or infect you with an illness that's going to infect you. Is there room for moderates in the Conservative Party? And where do I go? I'm a fiscal conservative social progressive. I feel like the Liberal Party, particularly in its current alliance with the NDP, has moved left. The Conservative Party has been taken over by truck convoys, people and the new Ontario Party and the Blue Party and the PCP Party. Where do people in the mainstream go to vote today? Where do they go to support? Where do they go see their policies and their ideology?
And whoever can answer that question will win the next general election. Because in my view, it's not so much about being centrist. It's this, there's swaths of Canadians who are just more pragmatic about these things, right? Like they're not ideological. We have to remember that. Most Canadians are not, they're not tied to one party over another, right? So for Mr. Poliov, I think this would be, again, if I were advising him, this would be my recommendation. You need to surround yourself now with folks, or include in your team folks who were supporting Mr. Charest and that sort of moderate voice, right? Because there's a degree, I think, of objectivity that can be brought to the discussion and whatever their value pitch is to the general public in the months ahead. Because make no mistake, everyone is watching him now and how this is going to evolve. So he is now responsible for defining and branding the party in a way that doesn't alienate voters, that shifts away from exploiting sort of the conspiracy, and what is the pragmatic solution that can be offered? And that's the question. Can that be done? Is that something, it's not a pivot, but is that something that he can do, that he can shift towards?
I saw an interview with Jenny Byrne, who was the campaign manager, I believe, for Pierre Poliov, and someone who I think was your vice chair or co-chair or something like that of the campaign. And the vitriol between them was incredible. The hatred, the insults between campaign workers, both members of the Conservative Party. If that's what happens not only between the leaders during a campaign, but between workers, can Poliov actually bring the rest of you into his fold?
Well, I think he can if he continues to open his arms the way that we're hearing he has been. I know that, for example, he reached out to Jean to, have a discussion with him after the leadership race. And at that time, my understanding is that he expressed interest in having, accepting CVs from people who had worked on Jean Charest's campaign to apply for roles in the OLO. And I think all of that is important. I think really ultimately there's two choices that need to be made. Mr. Poliov has to decide whether or not to win the next election, he's willing to set all of that aside, whatever the mudslinging was, put the infighting aside and recognize for the benefit of the party that it's good to have different voices and perspectives around the decision-making table. So that's one. And the second is, if moderates still want to be engaged in the conservative discourse, they have to remain engaged. Because if you don't, you shed any hope of having influence over the discussion. But that is a personal choice. And it's one I know a lot of people will be grappling with, myself included. So I suspect, my perspective on this is I'm waiting to see. Proof is in the pudding. We'll see sort of what comes out over the next couple of months from Mr. Poliov. But I'm hopeful that tone and approach matters so much. Style matters a great deal. So, if we see that sort of olive branch and an attempt to bring people in, that is a positive sign in my view, but we'll see if it continues.
We're chatting tonight with Michelle Coates-Mather, who is the former Director of Communications for the Jean Charest campaign in the leadership of the Conservative Party. It's been a fascinating conversation about Jean Charest versus Pierre Poliov, some of the vitriol that occurred between the candidates, some of the vitriol that occurred between the campaigns, how the Conservative Party grew dramatically in its membership, but did it grow by really adopting and being taken over by the trucker convoy, the PCP, et cetera, or did it grow with people that have historically been members of the Conservative Party? And while Pierre Poliov's campaign tactics, policies, statements that were very populist, which I think, Michelle, you agree with during the campaign, will that resonate with the balance of Canadians, or not even the balance, but a plurality that are on the center or center right, such that he can actually win? And I firmly believe that if he loses the next election, it's going to be because he won with the people that we've been talking about. He won with new people that didn't represent the mainstream.
Mm-hmm.
And if he wins the next election campaign, I think it's going to be because somehow either moderate conservatives for the interest of power, supported someone that they don't actually agree with their policies of, or somehow he changes his policies. Problem with that is that like Aaron O'Toole and trying to change, trying to pivot, and then people don't trust you anymore. I think it's going to be a fascinating couple of years. We're going to take a break, final break, and be back in just 2 minutes with some concluding comments with Michelle Coates-Mather. Thanks so much. Stay with us, everybody.
This meeting is being recorded.
Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Michelle Coates-Mather, who is the former director of communications for the Jean Charest campaign, and she currently runs a communications firm in Ottawa called Presence and Influence. If people want to check you out or try to hire your services or read your articles, what's the best way for them to follow you, contact you, etc.?
Yeah, so check out my website, so presenceandinfluence.ca, and just send me a note. You can DM me through my website.
I think what we should do is another interview sometime if you're interested on presence and influence, and just talk about how one achieves that, because I think that would be a fascinating conversation.
Awesome.
I got to ask you, you're probably a student of politics, a political junkie, watching what's going on not only in Canada but elsewhere in the world. Yeah. I really worry that that Canada is doing what Britain and the United States did like 4, 5, 6 years ago. And the Donald Trump Make America Great campaign, and we all read articles about how it was the angry white guy in middle America that took over the Republican Party, supported Trump, and meant that the reason why Hillary Clinton lost, and how a lot of Republicans supported Trump initially because they thought that frankly he was the best hope for the Republican Party to get power, and then maybe they after a while became a little bit embarrassed, and now they got no choice but to support him. Otherwise his support's so strong that he's gonna do a primary challenge against them, and like Liz Cheney, they're going to lose their career. And Boris Johnson, who seems to have done a lot of the same things, and we could probably go around the world and find a lot of other people like that. But over time, some of the craziness, some of the extremes mean that they're out of power, and people look back and they shudder. At least some people, not everybody, but they shudder at how ludicrous some of the policies were, and some of the support. Donald Trump supporting Putin, and how populism has been a takeover by, as you called it, the people that had grievances and were upset and angry. And they allowed those grievances to take over really the party as they gave voice to them. Is this happening in Canada today? Is this happening in the Conservative Party today? Is the Conservative Party today becoming MAGA North?
I think that there's a risk for that, but I'm hopeful, and this may be naive, but this is my hope, that cooler heads will prevail. And Mr. Poliov will recognize, because I do believe this to be true, that Canadians are not Americans, right? We have our own perspectives, our own beliefs. We are salt of the earth kind of people. And the swaths of the electorate are not aligning with what you and I are talking about here today, sort of American style, wedge style, identity division politics. It's not where most Canadians, I think, feel comfortable. So in my view, the role of the Prime Minister is to listen to those grievances, understand them, validate them, but not exploit them. And we exploit them when we add fuel to it without offering meaningful policies and solutions. And so what I hope that we will see from Mr. Poliov and his team are how are we solving this problem? Like what would you do differently to have prevented what we have just been through, for example? Or what is your meaningful roadway to recovery, where everybody can see themselves, a part of the solution? That is my hope. And time will tell whether he is up to that challenge.
You live in Ottawa?
I do.
I've talked to several people in Ottawa that say that Pierre Poliov really isn't a member of parliament from Ottawa. He's a member from the Ottawa Valley, and it's very conservative, very rural. very supportive of the trucker convoy, et cetera, and that if he was running as an MP in Ottawa, he would lose resoundingly. And that's sort of symptomatic of the problem the Conservative Party has. Everything you've said is true to a segment of the population, but not to mainstream Canadians. What do you think of that?
I mean, I think time will tell on that one too, because think about it. I mean, let's say an election isn't for another 2 years. We forget, we've got, let's face it, short-term political memories. People's anger around the convoy, it'll be a distant memory. So it may not make a difference. And if Mr. Poliov, if we're still in sort of a precarious fiscal situation in this country, can win on affordability alone, in my view. He doesn't have to continue to exploit sort of that segment or leverage that segment of the population who are feeling angry. He won't need to go down that path if we're still in this economic situation.
Michelle Coates-Mather, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate you. Number one, the role that you played during the campaign, because I think Jean Charest was a very credible candidate. If I was a Conservative Party member, I might have voted for Jean Charest, I have to admit. In a general election, I think a lot of people like me that sort of are in the center may have actually considered Jean Charest and are turned off by the current leader of the Conservative Party and his support of conspiracy theories and things like that. I think that what the Conservative Party has done and what Pierre Poliov has done is given the Liberal Party an unbelievable opportunity. Number one, so they can attack him with the policies that he talked about during the last campaign. And I've interviewed Warren Kinsella as an example where he went through a whole list of the things that he would do to very easily in the war room attack Poliov. But more importantly, I think this gives an opportunity for the Liberal Party to return to where it has historically been in the center of Canadian politics. And I think it was being crowded to the left, pushed to the left by political realities in the last couple of years. And maybe because that's where Justin Trudeau was comfortable, I'm not sure. But I think it gives a historic opportunity for the Liberal Party to return where it is. And I fear that might give the Liberal Party an opportunity to become, the party of power for a long period of time forward. And we're not going to get that healthy change that we should have. And I wonder whether instead of this being a reform and alliance and a progressive Conservative Party coming together to form a new Conservative Party, this is really a takeover of the Conservative Party by the reform, by the extreme right. And the Conservative Party is going to become a minority party. And Canadian politics is going to be forever shifted. But it'll be interesting to see what happens. And if I'm right, that'll give you and moderates an opportunity to create a new progressive Conservative Party in the future. You're right. Politics in the next couple of years is going to be really very interesting to watch. I happen to think it's going to be Chrystia Freeland versus Pierre Poliov, actually. Anyway, that's the show for tonight. We won't go there. Thanks for joining us, everybody. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from Ottawa, downtown Ottawa, at www.saga960am.ca. Good night, everybody. Thank you very much, Michelle Coates-Mather.